think it is, and I think people are really receptive to it and really stoked about it. And so, yeah, it's been awesome. You know, the decline of music obviously plays a big part in what you see on those figures and charts and sound scans and all that kind of stuff. And I think what quantifies the success of a band has totally changed over the years, whereas you used to be able to just kind of point at SoundScan and say, okay, this band's headlining, this band's, you know, direct support and yada, yada, yada. Now it's just a completely different game. And you know, there's a handful of bands, especially you look at some of the like urban stuff, that don't sell really much at all physical. And then, but what they do in streams or on SoundCloud or, you know, whatever, can pack out like, you know, a 5,000 seat venue, even though they're selling less records physically than we are. So that's pretty crazy, just trying to navigate the waters that are very new, kind of in a post-physical music world. Luckily for us, we have some pretty sweet diehard fans that still really appreciate the physical stuff. And so it gives us the ability to do the kind of deluxe edition stuff that we like to do, some of the collectors things that we like to do. Us as collectors, you know, it kind of fulfills our desire to kind of do something like that selfishly, because we love that kind of stuff as well. But it's awesome to have fans that really react to that kind of stuff, and have been supporting that kind of stuff from us for a long time.
Yeah, it's crazy thinking about, you know, album number 9 and 10, you know, even being released, you know, as quickly together as they were. I could just think, I feel like I just bought the first Demon Hunter album at a bookstore, like, you know, 10 minutes ago.
Right.
And you know, now we're 10 albums in. And I guess the first question I had for you more than anything was that one of the things I noticed about Demon Hunter, because I listened to kind of more Christian music growing up. It was all I was allowed to listen to for a long time. Sure. And you know, it's funny that how quickly Demon Hunter was kind of picked up by the more mainstream metal outlets. I don't know, like in the early 2000s. I think the first time I heard Demon Hunter was on actually on a Headbangers Ball compilation. Yeah. Which I wasn't totally prepared for, you know, because you know, it's right up there, you know, with Lamb of God and Flames. You know, you guys were definitely on you know, with a lot of great bands on that compilation. And was it surprising to you how easily Demon Hunter was picked up by the more mainstream metal audience? Or was that always the goal?
I mean, it was always definitely part of the goal. You know, I think that what we've wanted to achieve with this band has been, you know, early on there were really no expectations whatsoever, but as things started to kind of roll forward, it was like that element of kind of preaching to the choir was not ever something that was interesting to us. You know, there's a small facet of what we do that I hope resonates with like-minded individuals, and so that's a component of it. But on a much greater scale, being able to resonate with people who are not like-minded is also a very important part of what we do, and what's running through my mind when I'm writing lyrics and things like that. I don't really aim to alienate people to the degree where it sounds like I'm just kind of regurgitating some Christian, you know, Christianese, as they call it, you know, the rhetoric that people would kind of think would come from a Christian band. That filling that kind of stereotype is not something that I've ever wanted to really do with Demon Hunter. So it was always a hope that we would sort of fall in line with, you know, the In Flames and Lamb of Gods and, you know, Shadows Fall, like the peers that we had at the time and that they have now. I think it was always very much a part of the ultimate goal for us to kind of be seen and spoken of in the same kind of, you know, ways as those bands, which is why we never really made a thing of, you know, when we would tour playing Christian venues and things like that, though we've done a few, was never the kind of thing that we wanted to really throw all our eggs into. Sure. playing regular clubs with, quote unquote general market bands was always a very important thing to us. And so we're glad that there has been a good response and a good acceptance on that side of things. I think that is by virtue of us, hopefully, it's by virtue of just decent material and stuff that sounds really polished and in some capacity kind of keeps up with some of those peers.
Yeah, I think, Dan and I, this last week or so in preparation for this interview, we've kind of really been going back and forth on how necessarily we wanted to tackle this interview. And something that both of us kind of kept looking at and just kind of finding very interesting is just really the career that you guys have had, because it doesn't follow any traditional path in any way, shape, or form. Like Dan just kind of made the alluded to, with the fact that you guys were kind of a Christian band that, had mainstream success in a time where that wasn't necessarily as popular as it became. And, something I kind of was wondering is, do you feel that the way that you have navigated the band has allowed you to not burn your fans out and actually helped your career as Demon Hunter? Or do you feel like it's actually maybe hindered it in ways that maybe aren't as obvious to someone who's just looking at it from a broad spectrum?
I can kind of see both sides of the coin. In terms of, on the hindrance side, I mean, we'll never know if Demon Hunter would have been, bigger than we are if we would have decided to tour kind of full time, or take more of a traditional band stance in terms of the volume and frequency that we're out there playing and, in people's faces. So that will, that's one of those things that we'll never really know. What I can say, though, with a certain degree of certainty, is that the way that we have operated, which is infrequent touring, pretty frequent records as far as bands, releasing records goes. But in terms of functioning like a normal band in the live atmosphere, we definitely have kind of not ever played that game. And I believe that has actually helped sustain us in a number of ways. I think that the fact that we're here 10 albums and 18 years later is kind of due in part to our having not grinded it out the way that a lot of other bands have. We've got 3 members in Nashville and 2 of us up here in Seattle, and I don't see those guys all that often. So when I do, it's awesome, and we're still great friends. I've never grown sick of those guys. So there's still kind of like a camaraderie and like a fun to it that almost feels like it did in the very beginning, because it is so infrequent. And I think that has kind of helped us survive. And then from the perspective of, being in front of fans on a live, in a live way, I think that also has kind of worked in our favor over the years, where if we show up in, say, Dallas once every 5 years, our hope and what we've seen for the most part is that it's going to be a really big show, and a lot of people are going to show up, and there will be a lot of anticipation for it. And so it's much more of an event when we do kind of come through, because it is so infrequent. So that's one thing that we've been able to kind of count on when we do play, that people really take notice of it, as opposed to us kind of going around the nation, 2 or 3 times a year and being in every city, multiple times a year or whatever. I think that could have very well been to the detriment of our existence as a live band. So yeah, it's hard to say. I think it's kind of 6 in one hand, half a dozen on the other, in some regards. I know some of the guys in the band would have loved to tour more, especially in the early days. I mean, we all have kids now, and there's a lot of reasons why I think we're all on the same page now. But I used to feel a lot of guilt for not taking it on the show on the road, especially in the early days. just because I knew that a lot of the other guys in the band didn't really have the situation that I had, where I was basically able to kind of have my cake and eat it too. I had my design career, which I loved, and the regularity of that schedule, which I was very much more into than the schedule of touring. So when we did decide to tour, it was still fun. It was like a vacation for me. It almost still is. And so nowadays, we're all a little bit more on that same groove because, again, we have kids. Most of us have other careers, have a lot of stuff keeping us busy. So, yeah, I mean, that's the really long answer to that. But the short answer is I think that our infrequent touring has helped us more than hurt us.
One of the last questions I'll have and let Dan go after this is, thinking about how a lot of bands talk about the aspect of touring on a record allows them to kind of really see what's reacting in a live setting and so forth, and allow them to kind of grow more as a tighter unit musically. I guess I've never really, until you were just kind of talking about that, I never really thought about the fact that, I guess in theory, you're almost kind of missing out on those experiences and maybe where those situations might lead you in the creation of a new record. Is that something you've kind of thought about at all?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we notice when we're out, when we do go out for kind of longer stretches, or at least for us, longer stretches, you definitely hit a stride and hit a groove about a week in, and things from there on out feel really tight, and it just gets tighter. You're able to kind of start to improvise on stage a little bit. It opens up the doors for, feeling a little bit more freedom on stage and not so tense. A lot of times, like in the last couple of years, we've just done, for the most part, single day flyouts or, 2, maybe 3 shows in a row. And honestly, it's like, it's never enough time for us to hit that stride. And so we have, we've sort of lowered our expectations of how well we can, how much we can feel great about how well we played. And it's definitely interesting. We've felt the reality of that, hitting that stride when we do go on tour and knowing, oh, this is much better than like the first week of us playing. So we try and offset that sometimes with how much we rehearse before we go out, even if it is for 1 or 2 shows. But at the end of the day, there's really no replacement for that consistent, night after night playing. So at the end of the day, it kind of is what it is. I know that we don't want to do that. We don't want to grind it out to the degree where we're playing like weeks in a row. That's not to say we won't do a week here, a week there in the future. That's something that we do plan on doing, kind of smaller chunks. But yeah, I think there is maybe something that we're missing out on there, though. The way that we write, when it comes to how that might influence the way that we approach songwriting or recording an album in the future, I'm so comfortable with the sort of blueprint that's been set since the very beginning of this band, which is basically, for me, I like to write in a total vacuum by myself, no one else around, get feedback on that maybe later. But to me, it's a very personal, very, solitude-based thing is writing for me. And so, though I think that playing as a unit and things is great and feeling that stride is great, I don't necessarily think that I would want to somehow introduce that into the writing process in terms of bringing everyone together and kind of writing as a band. I haven't done that in 20 years. And I've tried to do it like on little projects that I have with friends. I've tried to sit in a room and write songs, and it's just not a zone I'm super comfortable in anymore. I like to kind of have the time to sit and mull over things myself and do them at my pace, and record or come up with demo stuff when the sparks are actually kind of flying. And I've noticed that when I sit in a practice room with other people, that's not the atmosphere where I feel most creative.
Interesting.
Well, and speaking on the touring thing, I'll try that again. And speaking on the touring thing, I think that's something that you're not necessarily unfamiliar with your being in bands prior to Demon Hunter. You know, like I was a big fan of Training for Utopia and Focal Point to a lesser degree.
Mm-hmm.
And those were bands that you guys definitely did try to sit back and do the grind,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and try to make it work. So I could definitely see what you're saying as far as with Demon Hunter, it's actually been more of a benefit to you in order to stay on. So I guess my question is, you know, you were around basically for the rise of the metalcore movement in the early 2000s, and you guys were playing music that was interesting before that, you know.
Yeah.
And were you surprised, or I guess more specifically, did you feel like whenever you guys came forward with the Demon Hunter concept, that was kind of more filling a void that was absent in kind of heavy music? Because I remember at the time when the first Demon Hunter album dropped, it kind of filled this void in that like bands were either super heavy,
Mm-hmm.
or they were so melodic that like heavy music fans really wouldn't get on board. Do you feel like that was something that you guys had set out to do from the outset, as kind of like make both parties kind of happy?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly, we saw that void. We saw that void in a number of different ways, both in the metal world in general. Like you said, you either have like full on, you know, onslaught heavy bands, and then you have bands who are doing a ton of melody. And then there were a handful of bands kind of doing something in between, like the Kill Switches or the Shadows Falls, bands like that. And for us, it was, you know, even when we were doing Training for Utopia, we had a real love of that kind of traditional, like 90s metal, pseudo thrash stuff, groove oriented stuff, Fear Factory, Sepultura, Deftones, Slipknot, you know, all the, and even the kind of slower material by some of the, you know, decidedly more death bands, like when Napalm did Inside the Torn Apart, or when Obituary did World Demise, you know, in that mid 90s era where everyone was kind of slowing down and grooving a little bit more. That was the stuff that was really interesting to us at the time. And then introduce At the Gates and In Flames and Soilwork and bands like that. And that started to really jive with us. So while we were doing Training for Utopia and really, you know, vibing off of Neurosis, Today is the Day, you know, Dead Guy, Bloodlet, and even some of the smaller bands, kind of niche bands in that scene, that for us felt more like we were, the irony of it is that felt more in hindsight like we were kind of jumping on that trend. Even though it was more of a pocket scene, it was more of a small thing, and it certainly hadn't erupted to the degree where, you know, you see bands now like Norma Jean who are actually really making waves, and there's a ton of people coming to shows and stuff. Like back in the day when we were doing TFU, it was not the sort of thing that would garner that kind of large mass appeal. So at the same time, when it came time for us to do another band, or when we kind of started thinking in that way, it was almost like going back to our first love of heavy metal, the Pantera, Metallica, like all the stuff that kind of had a groove and had a really slick production, pop sensible, for lack of a better term, to some degree, and to kind of really show off that melodic thing. We saw the void in metal in general for something like that, but then, like you mentioned before, in the Christian scene, there was really nothing at all like that. There were a lot of bands that were more of the fringe style stuff. You know, you had hardcore bands, and you had noisy bands, and you had like kind of cheesy alternative metal kind of bands, but there really wasn't anything that fell into that metalcore / groove metal, or even moderately traditional like 90s metal. There was nothing in that, in the area of that. And that was the stuff that we were really kind of, that had continued to resonate with us, you know, 10, 20 years later. So really what we wanted to do is open up the doors for us to do something that we felt would appeal to us 10, 20 years into us doing it. And that's really what kind of, I'm really glad that we chose that with Demon Hunter, you know, putting things like the ballads on every record, giving ourselves kind of a bigger sandbox to play in, definitely leaning on melody, which is something that we've kind of increased over the years. All of those kind of allowed us to expand that blueprint and expand like what we felt like exploring. And so it's made the whole journey a lot more enjoyable, and it doesn't necessarily feel like a prison where we have to do this one thing. I feel like there's a ton of room for us to explore within our sound. And so I'm still like, every time I sit down to do a Demon Hunter record, despite not being, you know, really super wowed by a lot of modern metal, I still get really excited to sit down and record or write a Demon Hunter record.
Kind of, you know, talking to the newest record, you know, you've said a couple of times in interviews that you didn't want to put out a double album in the traditional sense of like, here it is packaged together and so forth. With kind of the theme and the separation of songs themselves from kind of heavier songs to the more ballady, kind of slower ambient stuff, it kind of has made me wonder, was there ever a thought of maybe releasing this as like a series of EPs, maybe akin to like what Thrice did with like the Alchemy Index?
No. I mean, this has been something that's been on our radar for a while, the idea of doing 2 records and kind of polarized, you know, showcasing the polarized styles. What we didn't know is exactly how that would pan out in terms of, would the heavy record be just like an onslaught, and would the ballad record be like acoustic? You know, as it came closer to us actually diving in and writing these songs, it became apparent to me that I wanted the freedom to be able to kind of explore every version of a, what I like to call like south of heavy song for Peace. You know, so there's kind of straightforward rock songs, there's electronic kind of key, you know, synth-based songs, there's stripped down piano ballads, there's kind of the doomier sounding, like slower, like ballad, quote unquote ballad kind of songs that we have on there. And so I knew that I wanted to be able to, pretty early on in writing, I knew that I wanted the freedom to be able to do whatever I wanted to do on, especially on Peace. But I didn't want it to just kind of fall into that category of like, here's the acoustic counterpart to the really heavy record. And even in doing the heavy record, I wanted it to flow like a Demon Hunter record would, just kind of scraping off that 20-25%, which would, you know, be a couple of ballads on the record. And so throughout the process, the concept of them being very listenable in their own right, like each one kind of being its own unit that had the same sorts of peaks and valleys that a normal Demon Hunter record would have, started to become really important. Especially since we were separating the two and it wasn't supposed to be like one 20-song journey. I started looking at it like, how could these records resemble what we would normally do, but just kind of be 2 sides of a coin.
Have you been Did you expect one record to do better than the other?
We really didn't know. It's interesting. If you look at the type of feedback that we get via comments on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, our fan club, whatever it is, you would think that our fans are more likely to want heavier stuff. But then if you look at the numbers, like what I would consider to be more like the actual nuts and bolts of the statistics, at least from the ones where it's, you know, where we have access, Spotify, iTunes, Amazon, all that kind of stuff. The ballads or the slower songs by far and away outperform all the heavy stuff. So if you look at like, I mean, our number 1 song on Spotify by a long shot is a B-side from a few records ago that is just strings and me singing, you know, I Am a Stone. And then I think the few underneath that are, you know, at least for a long time, were like Carry Me Down and the heavier songs that start to kind of infiltrate those top songs are like Last One Alive, which is melodic all the way through, or Collapsing, which is melodic vocals all the way through. So even the songs that are decidedly heavier, the more popular ones are the ones that I'm singing basically all the way through. So we didn't know. We had no idea. The label thought for sure that the heavy one would outsell. It's been fairly close, but the heavy one has kind of outsold the other one. Again, I don't know. That could be a number of different things. I think some people might just see that one first, you know. Maybe it pops up for them first, and they just kind of buy it thinking that there's only one. Who knows? But I think our fans, it's pretty even Steven in terms of what they want to hear. They want to hear heavy, but they want to hear it with melody. And so I think they've kind of come full circle to the point where that's what they expect, is to get both. You know?
Well, I think that speaks to the uniqueness of the brand. You know, I think that I definitely, and I don't mean this in a negative light, I definitely consider Demon Hunter to be a gateway band into more extreme styles of music. You know, if you've grown up only listening to top 40 radio, you're gonna want to start that friend that, you know, is into, like, you know, maybe not as heavy as stuff. You're gonna want to start them on a Carry Me Down,
sure,
or you know, something like that. So I do wonder if you think that maybe that's part of it. You know, part of why people tend to gravitate towards the ballads, because the ballads can be played for everyone.
Sure.
Whereas, you know, you throw a song like Cross to Bear on there, you know, there's only a certain amount of people that are going to, you know, jump onto that, you know, right away.
Well, that's something we hear a lot, is that you guys were the first band that was this heavy that I ever listened to. And it was almost always because what they found first was Dead Flowers or Carry Me Down or Heartstrings or something like that. And then they kind of, their palette started to kind of like open up little by little until they were really, you know, completely sold on an entire record or the whole catalog. We hear that quite a bit. And so the concept of being a kind of a gateway band is very much a true thing for us. And even as it relates to, you know, fans going from Demon Hunter to heavier stuff, into a Lamb of God or whatever it is, that's something that we also hear about a lot, is that we were basically the first metal band that someone, you know, really got them into metal, and then they kind of went from there.
I was wondering, were there any other title names that you were working on for this double release? And if so, what were they?
Well, the very first iteration was Him and Hearse, Hymn and Harse.
Clever.
And then there was a Blessing and a Curse. Both of those names, to me, were a little bit, I don't know. I think of everything very visually. And I also, for some reason, the idea of the melodic, the name of the melodic record coming first in the phrase, like a blessing and a curse. I knew from the onset that I wanted the heavy record to kind of be the first word in the phrase. And so Hymn and Hearse and Blessing and a Curse, that was definitely kind of a disconnect for me there, is like having the melodic record be first in that phrase. I know that seems like minutia, but those were working titles, and I think there might have been a couple more, but those were the ones that were definitely on the block for a while. When I liked the simplicity of War and Peace, you know, when it really kind of boiled down to it, it's simple and easy to remember, but also says a lot about not only where we are as a people and in the world today, and it's a little bit topical, but also, you know, what we do as a band in terms of our faith and our spirituality and things like that. So despite it being probably the most simple version of the titles, it's the one that felt like it said the most.
adversely, there's the band Him. I don't know if you're familiar with them at all. One of the last records they put out, they did an interesting thing where they put out the record as the 12 song itself, and then kind of did a reimagining of it, like acoustically, sort of as like the double album and so forth. So it's kind of thinking about that in the way that they kind of tackled that project, because it's almost sort of akin to what you did with War and Peace, and it kind of made me wonder, potentially, were there either any songs that maybe started off as being a heavy song or one of the kind of more slower songs that then kind of morphed through the songwriting process to be something for the other album, or adversely, as well as that, when you're working on something like this, did you decide to play around with maybe a song on the War album and kind of have its counterpart on the Peace, like lyrically, thematically, and all that?
Well, in terms of a song, like not knowing exactly which direction a song was going to go and where it would fall, there was never a big shift during the songwriting or recording process where a song was like, whoa, it went from this to this. What was more of an issue on a couple of songs is exactly where they would fall, is because they were like kind of right smack dab in the middle. If you listen to a song like Gray Matter on War, it's heavy-ish. It has the kind of, the double kick chorus, but the tempo's kind of not super fast. It's melodic vocals all the way through. And so it was actually kind of hard to be like, does this one fit on War entirely? And then there are songs even on Peace that probably could have gone either way. A song like Two Ways, that would probably be the heavier song on Peace, which probably could have gone on to War. So that there was a little bit of, grappling with that on a couple of songs, like which direction that they were going to go. But at the end of the day, it kind of helps give both albums that sort of peaks and valleys that I wanted. And then thematically, kind of lyrically kind of weaving themes through the albums or things like that. It definitely wasn't something that was ever present in my mind while I was writing lyrics, is to have things kind of connect and point back. It's something that we talked about a little bit, whether or not we wanted to do that, have these kind of mirrored things happening throughout the albums. And we kind of went back and forth on how much we wanted to do that and whether or not we wanted to do it at all. At the end of the day, having the freedom to kind of write whatever was coming, whatever was cropping up and whatever felt right, having the freedom to do that, like without having a filter of, oh, it's got to do this, it's got to speak to some other song on the other record, or it has to be a counterpart to something. That just felt more natural for us. And so we kind of skirted most of the concepts about having things kind of mirror each other between the albums. There are a couple of things that almost hit me as I was finishing up a song, with lyrics or something like that, where I would be like, oh, it might be cool if I said this, and it kind of pointed back to another song. So like the last song on Peace, Fear is Not My Guide, ends with the line, Death is on My Side, which is, from On My Side, which is on War. So there's very subtle little things like that, probably only like 3 or 4 of them. The song Peace starts with, I see you waiting for a sign. And the song On My Side starts with, I've been waiting, give me a sign. So there are a couple of very subtle tie-ins, nothing that's super, Easter eggy or hidden or anything like that. And some of them were more happenstance than anything else. But those are the couple that I did kind of somewhere along the line go, oh, that might be cool, But I didn't want to go too far into that direction.
Well, and considering, and I know you've probably answered this in other podcasts, I tried really hard to listen to all the podcasts you were on before we did, so I wouldn't repeat questions.
That's right.
But with Demon Hunter, one of the things that stands out to me the most is the lyrics. And, do you guys get a lot of pushback for having predominantly more negative style lyrics, with considering that a certain percentage of your fan base is probably still rooted in that Christian traditionalist mindset? Do you guys ever get blowback for like, why do you guys talk about death all the time, or why do you talk about and then, like, as a general metal fan, like, I get it in that, like, it's it's part of life,
Yeah, I mean, and it is very much a part of the faith that we subscribe to as well. I mean, there's an inherent connection to death, and whether that ends in eternal life or whatever it is, but that is being a reoccurring theme for us. It's kind of a shoe-in, given the concept of death only being a part of life and life continuing after that. It's ripe for the taking in terms of imagery and songs and things like that. So that is kind of decidedly where I usually go, especially with the heavier stuff. And there's always a little bit of scrutiny regarding like the exact phrasing of certain things, and I'm always aware of where it's going to come and what phrases and lines people might kind of wig out about. I kind of know where that line is, and if I'm going to write something that kind of tries to stir the pot a little bit or kind of poke at that like fundamental mindset, it's going to be on purpose, and I'm going to be able to do it I do it deliberately, and I'm going to be able to kind of explain why I do it if someone asks about it. And so I'm always very prepared for, what type of scrutiny is going to come by virtue of a song like Cross to Bear or whatever. That song is kind of equal parts like super bold faith and like just saying not one of you bastards has a cross to bear is obviously going to ruffle some feathers.
Sure.
So all of those decisions are always very deliberate on my part. And I've been doing it long enough to kind of know how to navigate like whatever type of scrutiny comes down the pike,
Something Dan and I were talking about actually right as you were calling in is between, Training for Utopia, Focal Point, Demon Hunter, and I'll even kind of bring in Knives into it, is it's kind of put you in my headspace for the last couple of days. I have an interview coming up with Spencer from Periphery. Periphery kind of is just, part of my language, is kind of a mind fuck of a band as far as what they do and how many allusions they make to so many other things. So I've been kind of just really rooted in looking at a band's discography and all the individual members because of how much they pull literally from other stuff that they've done in demo form and these other bands. And kind of in looking at what you have done between your whole musical career, it's interesting to kind of see how really focused everything is and not really shared across any of the other things. Like Training for Utopia doesn't really necessarily sound like Demon Hunter or vice versa, and Knives doesn't sound like anything that's necessarily in any of these things. And I find that really interesting because you can look at someone like Chino in the Deftones, and it's like you can see what he's done in Crosses and Ices and Palms and so forth, and you see some of the influences kind of bleeding into itself. And I don't really feel like I see that in a lot of your art. And it makes me wonder, is it because of maybe your graphic design brain or something like that, where you're able to kind of compartmentalize these different facets of you, that's why that is? Or what is kind of the reasoning behind that?
Well, first of all, I love a ton of different kinds of things for a bunch of different reasons, I could be fully content being in like an old crusty Misfits sounding band. And if I did that, I would want it to sound like that and stay like that. And, I would want that sort of vision to be seen through like to the T. On the flip side, if I want to do something that sounds more like Nine Inch Nails or Depeche Mode, I want it to be pure in a sense, and take the components of the influences that I love from that world and put them in there. But I don't really I don't really jive on the melding of styles beyond a certain degree. I think I like things for what they are, to be honest. I like metal to be metal, within reason. I like, even when it, like you said, my design mind, it is partly, is it on brand? Is it on brand for Demon Hunter to do a song that sounds like this or like that? Luckily, like I said, we have a big sandbox to play in, so we can do, kind of electronic-y heavy songs like Recuse Myself, and it still fits and people still dig it. But if I'm going to go full bore in that direction, I'm going to step aside and do Knives. Or if I want to kind of like another band that I do with Jason Martin of Starflyer 59 is called Lo and Behold, and that is more of like a throwback to Sisters of Mercy or some of those old original dark wave kind of 80s bands. And if I'm going to do that, I want it to sound like that. I want it to kind of be what it says on the tin, so to speak. And so there is a part of my design mind is thinking like, is it on brand? Does it work? Would it be too left field for us to do? Would it alienate people? Would they, all that stuff is kind of moving through my brain when I'm thinking about like where to explore within any one of those bands. But, again, like from the design perspective, I like tattoos that look like tattoos. I like graffiti that's on walls. I like tattoos that's on skin. I like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So if you take a tattoo and you put it on an album cover, my thinking is like, okay, better on skin. And if you take graffiti and put it on skin, I think that belongs on a wall, looks lame on the arm. Like there are certain things that to me belong in certain places. And so, yeah, I think that partially informs the way that I think when I think, okay, how far outside can I go with a Demon Hunter song? How far in the direction of an electronic song can I go with a Demon Hunter song? Or, with a ballad can I go with a Demon Hunter song? And vice versa for some of the other bands that I play in. I do want, at the end of the day, each of those entities to feel like a cohesive vision, like a well thought out and well constructed vision that has some sort of baseline, an understanding of like where those boundaries are.
Kind of one of my last questions, a two-parter though. What is a style that you haven't played around in that you would love to, that maybe is unexpected? And secondly, if there was a Ryan Clark solo record, what would that sound like?
I can't say I haven't thought about it. Although Knives was kind of my answer to a solo record. The first thoughts I had about doing a solo record was that they would be decidedly electronica-ish, in more of a Nine Inch Nails or Depeche Mode vein. And then in talking to a handful of people about helping contribute the instrumentation or like the building of those songs, because I didn't want to kind of like rely on myself to be able to do that stuff, especially from a production standpoint. I'm very limited in that regard. So at the end of the day, I would need someone to kind of help me construct the songs that are in my head. And I had talked to a few people, or kind of had a short list of people that I wanted to collaborate with. Randy was one of those people. And he was on board immediately. He started sending me stuff. I really loved it immediately. And he started sending me more. And before I knew it, it was just kind of like, well, why would I need to collaborate with anyone else when I'm getting basically all the stuff I want to hear from this one guy? And then I've always, at the same time, I've always never been super into solo records that are just a guy's name. And so that's never really appealed to me. I don't love my name. It's the name of a football player. It's the name of some other singer-songwriter guy. You know what I mean? It's a very common name. So I didn't like it in that context either. And so I feel like if I were ever to do something like that, it would be named some sort of band, even if it was just me. And so that's kind of what Knives was, although Randy, is a giant part of why those songs sound the way that they do. But if I were to ever do like an actual more stereotypical solo record, I feel like a style that I haven't done that I would like to kind of play around with would be sort of a traditional Americana, like neo-Gothic, Gothic in the cool Victorian sense, not the Hot Topic sense.
Right.
Something in the vein of like a Don Gibson. I don't know if you've ever heard him. Daughan Gibson. He's got a really low register, and he kind of does this. It's almost adjacent to like an alt country, but it never goes full on country. It's got a twang to it, but in almost like a haunting way.
Okay.
Similarly, I have a buddy here named TJ who does a thing called King Dude. And that's kind of, again, really haunting. It's just kind of soaked in reverb, and there's kind of like an eeriness to it, but it's got that kind of traditional, almost gospel-y, like stylings to it. Something in that vein would probably be the direction that I would go with it. Something that would be kind of acoustic-y, but very much in like a haunting way.
Very cool. So I think in wrapping up, the last thing I noticed just recently is you guys are booked for the Louder Than Life Festival.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of wanted to get a background on that. That's something that we try as podcasters to try to get to as many festivals as we can. And so I was very surprised to see Demon Hunter on there. What came about with that as far as you guys getting on there?
Yeah, well, we've done a show that those are kind of the Danny Wimmer, the big festivals. They're obviously tons of big bands, and they're a lot of fun. We had the opportunity to do one Chicago in 2017, I believe. It was a ton of fun. And so it's always kind of been on our radar to try and go after more of those kind of festivals. And we were kind of waiting to hear back about that one. We got the offer, and it was really great. So that'll be a lot of fun. And that also kind of allows us to kind of use that show as a bit of an anchor point and hopefully book some shows around it. So right now, that's kind of what's on our radar is now that we have that one kind of solidified and we know what day we're playing, our hope is to kind of build a little mini, batch of shows around it. So we're excited to do that.
Very cool. Well, hopefully we will see you there.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
And what does the rest of this year look for you as far as any of your projects at all?
Yeah. Well, I'm dabbling in some stuff with Jason, who I do Lo and Behold with. Starting some things there, although that'll be kind of slow. Always kind of batting ideas around with Randy about doing Knife stuff, although he's super busy and I've been real busy. So that's a real kind of slow moving ship. And then, right now it's all Demon Hunter on the docket. We recently relaunched our fan club, which is about 10 years old, but we relaunched it in November into a much bigger, broader thing. And we basically come up with content almost every single day to post on there. And so that's a pretty huge endeavor, and it keeps us really busy. It's a way for us to kind of interact with our fans despite not being on the road, and kind of offer something that I think a lot of bands wouldn't be able to offer. And so we put a ton of time and effort. It's been a few years in the making and kind of building a lot of that foundation of content and stuff. So that keeps me pretty busy, to be honest, throughout my weeks. And then we're looking forward to booking some dates. So.
And then lastly, where can everyone find you and or the band online?
I'm pretty much off of social media. You can find me there, but I won't actually be on the other side of it.
Must be nice.
The band, obviously, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, at Demon Hunter. I think Twitter is actually at Demon Hunter Band. One of them is at Demon Hunter Band. And then demonhunter.net and theblessedresistance.com, or blessedresistance.com is the fan club. And we're putting more stuff up there than all of the other socials and things like that combined. So
awesome. Well, thank you again for taking the time, and like Dan said, echoing the sentiment, looking forward to catching you at Louder Than Life this year.
Thanks, guys. It's been great.